Welcome back to the Deep End. This is episode 22. Today I'm joined by Brett Veinotte, Kevin Cole, Jay Dyer, author of Esoteric Hollywood, is in the house, and Dylan LeFebvre here in studio. Jay, the first part of this is going to be conversation. He just put his glasses on. The first part of this conversation, we're going to focus at you, and then I'll open it up to everyone else to ask you questions about your book. But first of all, the book full title is Esoteric Hollywood: Sex, Cults and Symbolism in Film. Why did you write this book, and who did you write it for? Who's the main audience you're talking to?
I wrote this book because I was eating dog food out of soup cans and I needed to make money, as I told Brett yesterday. So I was blogging for years and I didn't really ever think much would come of that. And so what I was doing in undergrad was looking at a lot of film and philosophy, and then the same subject matter into grad school. And so after a while, I just had, this giant bevy of articles that I felt like could eventually probably be a book, but I didn't really think much about it. And I finally got asked by a publisher, do you want to publish it? Chris at Trine Day. And I said, yeah, I think that there's enough material here, for something decent. And the reason that I focus on this was, one, just because I guess you guys too, we all grew up in the 80s. And so we were just suffused with 80s culture, pop culture. And the more that I dove into the subject of Hollywood and who influences Hollywood and who's in the background, at the same time as I was studying ancient philosophy, I started noticing parallels between Greek theater and how the Greeks viewed theater and what methods of propaganda even Plato mentions, for example, through the theater. At the same time as I was studying like a whole class on Oliver Stone films in college. And so I was just noticing all these parallels at the same time as I was blogging and writing about these topics, and throughout my 20s, learning about geopolitics and 9/11 and all that kind of stuff. And so it all just kind of fell into place. It finally came together. And after doing some interviews and a few podcasts, I started work on the book about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And it was a long process. A lot of time and effort went into it, and a lot of difficulties in terms of figuring out how to organize it. But the book was written to peel the layer back, like Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz. When Dorothy looks behind the curtain and it's just this little man back there with this big projector and smoke and mirrors. And you realize that a lot of the mystique, a lot of the mystery, a lot of what we think of as these stories that supposed to perhaps give our lives meaning, these perennial films, a lot of them actually turned out to be propaganda. And this goes way back, which I touch on a little bit in the book. You go all the way back to the earliest days of the camera. You go into the period of Howard Hughes and Hell's Angels and these different movies that were at the behest of the Pentagon. And Charlie Chaplin movies were actually propaganda. So what you discover is this incestuous relationship for a long time between various deep state power players, mob groups, mafia groups. It's all very fascinating, but it all ties into the history of Hollywood. And the reason Hollywood matters is that Hollywood is more powerful than the news, I would argue, because we don't remember news stories from a month ago, from 2 months ago, a year ago, unless it was something like 9/11. But everybody remembers 2001: A Space Odyssey. Everybody remembers Star Wars, right? Everybody. So they have much more power in terms of the collective psyche and giving us a message and a meaning than boring bureaucrats and boring newscasters up there talking and rambling. So it's just a fascinating rabbit hole to go down, and nobody, I don't think, has written a book like this. I mean, you have these kind of more watered down poppy versions. I'm not a big fan of Vigilant Citizen. That stuff doesn't get into very, very deep grounds at all, deep water. It just kind of surveys the surface. But what I try to do was bridge the gap between being too academic and being obscure and being too poppy. So I tried to go that middle route and produce a book that looked at perennial films, perennial directors, Hitchcock, Spielberg, you name it. And what were they trying to say in these movies? Not so much the directors themselves, because everybody always asks me, was Stanley Kubrick part of the conspiracy? I don't really go into that. I don't go into whether Spielberg's personal motives or this or that. I just go into the films and the film symbolism because that's what I find most fascinating.
Well, you did an excellent job. I can see what you're saying because it's so easy to go down the rabbit hole with Spielberg or Kubrick and any of these characters, especially Hitchcock. Like you just put the one paragraph and the one footnote and be like, hey, he was making these movies with Sidney Bernstein during World War II for MI6, and John Ford and these other guys were doing a very similar thing in America. Frank Capra, all these guys were making films for the government, and then comparing, not only Hollywood to the government filmmaking, because you're talking about, what was that, Mountaintop Studios where Jared Leto lives now, where it was like 120,000 square foot studio space where the government made more films than Hollywood ever did. That was a interesting part. But from what you were just saying right there, I think you've hit on something that I don't think was mentioned in your book. But contrast because you said motion pictures have such a huge influence and really have this long lasting effect on people, and news doesn't. And I would argue it's because news is meant to be consumed and disposed of every day, like a newspaper. You're not supposed to remember it because it's not told in a narrative, and films are always giving you this narrative based upon what they've learned from Greek theater all the way up, which we would call like sociology, or on the far end, psychological warfare today. And almost all the films you noted in your book are films that most people have seen, but have never thought about what they're seeing. And I think you did a great job doing an analysis and just bringing it down step by step. It's like, here's all the different layers that are being built out, and now you can see it more in its totality. So it lives up to a Jay's analysis book.
Well, thank you. I know that. So if you think about the two fathers of analyzing propaganda that everybody knows about, like Edward Bernays, and maybe less known but still very important was Jacques Ellul, who wrote Propaganda: The Formation of Men's Attitudes,
and Technological Society, right?
Right. Both of them say that Hollywood is the most powerful means of propaganda in the world.
As well as Hitchcock said the same thing.
So that's why it's so important, and that's why I think it was needful to deconstruct it. But it's not like the book is intentionally intended to be a blending of different things. So it's not just esoteric analysis of what are the religious symbolism that we can find in Eyes Wide Shut. It's not just what was Vertigo really about, what was Hitchcock trying to say with that, what was British propaganda trying to do with any of these other films. It's a blending of all these things. And what I try to do is pick different directors that I thought had different foci, and then illustrate that through 2 or 3 of their films. Because the book wasn't planned to be a book. It was analyses that I wrote over time. And then I started realizing that actually I'd done a few Spielberg films, right? I had done quite a few Kubrick films just because they were so culturally important. And then you start noticing patterns. Like you notice that Kubrick often talks about pedophilia in his movies. He's often talking about the power structure engaging in these kinds of depraved actions. So it's not just Eyes Wide Shut. That comes up in The Shining in a more subtle way.
And Lolita.
Lolita, obvious one, right? The Nabokov novel. So you find it in Barry Lyndon, right? So many of these films will have these same themes. He'll talk about government subterfuge. He'll use Freudian imagery and try to, I think, show how the Frankfurt School and the Freudians knew that they could manipulate Western civilization through hypersexualization, right? Through the Kinsey type stuff.
Sure.
And I think that Kubrick knew that. And so he's oftentimes utilizing Freudian symbology to show that. Clockwork Orange is full of that, for example, as is Eyes Wide Shut. So, you just start to see these patterns in directors, and you think, I tried to balance the artistic analysis with the consideration of who might be doing propaganda as well. So, for example, if I was looking at Spielberg films, I'm looking at, like in AI, the transhumanist message that's pretty obvious in AI, I would say. And you find other elements in Spielberg, like Minority Report, where he's dealing with transhumanism as well. So, those are just 2 examples of what kind of stuff we're talking about.
Well, since you're talking about Kubrick, I've looked a lot into Kubrick over the years, and what I've noticed is there's the documentaries you mentioned. There's this whole body of work about Kubrick and what did he know and why was he a recluse and what was he trying to tell you through his films. One of the patterns that I had noticed was psychopathy. Almost every one of his films,
That's a good one.
Focuses on some sort of psychopathy. And I'm a fan of Kubrick from the side of making films because he kind of knew how to do everything on the set. He didn't necessarily do it himself, but he knew how to do it. So then you can be sure to know how to do it right, right? So from a filmmaker perspective, I was always interested in Kubrick. And then you get into all this other stuff. He had interest in gold. I think he wrote a book. It had corresponded with Anthony Sutton at some point, asking about, like, what did you figure out about these guys? And he seemed to always be pointing a finger in a direction through his films and the imagery. There's a lot of great images in your book from frames in his film where I'm like, oh, I missed that, but it totally makes sense because whether it's Eyes Wide Shut, which the thing I thought maybe you mentioned it, maybe because I read it over, several sittings at my desk. Maybe I missed this part, but Kubrick had just premiered Eyes Wide Shut a couple days, I thought, before his death. And the studio heads, they're like, hey, you got to change this and you got to cut this up. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. And then he ends up dead a couple days later. And then there was the other piece where this, Wag the Dog, where you're talking about it and you talk about Stanley. And so I just thought, oh, well, the movie's about Stanley, a filmmaker who can't keep his mouth shut, who ends up dead. Even though Wag the Dog was put out before Kubrick's death, I always just, maybe it was just me thinking that there was more message there than it was.
That's interesting. Why that was new to me because my understanding was that the Stanley guy there was roughly based on like a Milt Bearden or a Chase Brandon figure. No, excuse me. That's the Robert De Niro character. I take that back. I don't know. I was not aware of who the Dustin Hoffman character might be. But that's intriguing there.
It's a filmmaker named Stanley who can't keep his mouth shut after being involved in a government project. And then they whack him. And I thought, what an interesting shot across the bow to Kubrick, who was living as a recluse at that point. And then there was that mockumentary. I don't want to stray too far away from your book, but for people who are interested in Kubrick and who read your book, the next step is there was this mockumentary where it was like half truth, half actors. And it was about, right after Kubrick died, his wife opened the safety deposit box. And then there's this story. And it's about basically how he was involved in using the Barry Lyndon 50 millimeter Zeiss lens that was from this. Right. So you mentioned that part. And I was like, oh, is he going to mention this other part to that? Like, how did he have access? So there, the other interesting thing was there was this mockumentary and I'll cut it in the B-roll afterwards. But for like, the hour after I watched it, I was like, wow, that was really, so let me look these guys up. And I found out some of the people in the documentary are real and it's footage taken out of context. And some of the other people were actors in the movie. And when you put it all together, it's like, they can't tell you directly because of maybe too much liability on their end, but it just seemed to hint at Kubrick having a much closer relationship with the government because after the government saw Dr. Strangelove in 2001, they're like, your fake stuff looks better than our real stuff.
Looks better, right? Yeah.
We have problems doing photography in these environments. Can you help us out? So I know you didn't want to touch on that because that's controversial in your book. Yeah. But let's talk about it. If you know,
I just don't know. I don't know I didn't dive into the background of Kubrick himself because again, I'm not saying it's not relevant or interesting. It is, but what I wanted to really talk about was just the symbolism in the films themselves.
Right.
And that's the main focus of the book. And that's because the more that you dive into the directors themselves, you could write a whole book on Hitchcock. You know what I mean? Like there's so much that you to deal. I just had to cut down the material. And in fact, the book would have been a lot bigger. But the publisher, there's rules about books. Like if your book is over 400 pages, there's a big drop in the number of people that will buy it just because of the size. So we wanted to keep it under 400 pages. So a lot of stuff couldn't be included that I wish had been included, but
second edition.
Other things that, hopefully there'll be sequels, but it's my freshman outing. So
keep it manageable. You got it out there. So how did you come to talk to Chris about getting your book published at Trine Day?
When I went on Buzzsaw the first time 2 years ago and talked with Sean Stone, Chris, I guess, watches Buzzsaw, and I've known people in his circles and he knew people in my circle. So he just reached out with an email and was just like, hey, do you have a book? And technically I didn't, but I had, more than enough articles for a book. So that began the process and of just kind of collecting and putting the books together under different directors and their films. And then it was supposed to be out like 6 months before it actually came out because but it was stalled because he felt like there needed to be explanatory boxes, within the novel that actually turned it into more of like a textbook, which is fine with me. I don't really mind, but.
So that was Chris's suggestion to put those in?
Chris's idea was like, hey, nobody's going to know who Ray Kurzweil is. Nobody knows about, who James Shelby Downard is. Nobody knows what Hellfire Club is.
It's useful, dude. Yeah. It's useful. I thought it was a great part of the format.
It was like another month of writing. So I had to go back and I typed up probably 50 of these. So it's another, you're getting.
And then it changes the format and all the pages and the footnotes and everything like that. But that was a good recommendation on Chris's part because it's a useful addition in your book. I think it I knew who most of the people were, but like I said, I tweeted yesterday, I'm like on page 116 or 143 or whatever it was. I was like, this guy, Hadley,
mm-hmm.
right? That guy, he's like, so I'm reading in Jay's book for those of you guys who didn't get the email yesterday, for Brett and Kevin. I'm reading through his book and I know most of the stuff. I'm familiar with these characters. All of a sudden, it's like, the Orson Welles 1938 War of the Worlds was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. I was like, what's Jay's source on this? Let me flip to the endnotes. It's endnote. Okay, James Tracy article on global research. Well, that seems valid. Let me go click into that. Oh, wait, the guy has a Wikipedia page. Oh, it says he worked for the Princeton Research Radio Project, and they got funding from Rockefeller, and then they did the thing with the War of the Worlds psychological warfare op, and then he wrote a book on it. So I'm putting all this in the history blueprint. I was like, that's pretty good. I should tweet that to other people. So, I mean, even though I'm familiar with most of this content, I was still like a little tickled to be like, oh, little mention of Percy Silito. And, he was this MI6 director that also worked for De Beers, and he's part of the Cecil Rhodes Anglo-American establishment. So it was just these little things that I know about them, but this is from another angle. I hadn't thought about these guys really in movies. But one thing I did notice was you talk about Alexander Korda and London films. And I had learned about it's Alexander Korda and his brother Zoltan Korda. They worked for London Films, which is the MI6 front, and they used a film company to go into these different countries and make a bunch of different films. And these guys were also connected to Ian Fleming and the whole British American double cross system that came in. So I thought, if you're ever going to do a second edition or break out some of these things and get people to come to your website and check out more, these are little places that go into other things that people know about. And those are other hooks that can get people. It's like, oh, I know about this. So I'm going to read Jay's book to learn more about these other aspects. Cause they're definitely involved in all levels of the film industry, from psychological warfare, just down to general people's entertainment and entrainment.
Right. So one of the things that I noticed when I was working on my thesis, which was on Bond, and you and I have talked about that before, and the usage of Bond as propaganda, was I started noticing how close the espionage intelligence community was for a long time to theater, right? So even prior to what we think of as golden age, silver age of Hollywood, you had this long connection in British imperial praxis of using people in the theater. And that goes all the way back to Shakespeare, Victorian era type stuff, Elizabethan era stuff. So it's not a new idea to co-opt a person who's an actor into being a spy. Elizabeth was known for having these vast networks of spies. And this would include all levels of society. So it's only natural that we would expect that with the giant social engineering tool that is Hollywood. And again, it's there from the beginning. And when you had the America First movement, which Quigley deals with extensively, or in many chapters in Tragedy and Hope, he discusses that as the only real opposition historically to foreign interventionism in terms of American foreign policy and their nationalism and so forth. And it's often derided as this Nazi type thing, but that's not exactly true. There were a lot of people who were not at all interested in National Socialism, who were just simply pro-American. They wanted to focus on America first. And Quigley actually admits a lot of that, and he makes fun of it because he sees it like as this backwards type of thing. And, we're going into the global era. I mean, this is just so stupid.
Yeah, because Quigley's a liberal at Georgetown, so he's like poo-pooing all those ideas.
Yeah. But so what had to happen which Quigley sort of brushes over this a little bit, is that you have this influence of the Anglophiles in Hollywood. And you and I have talked about this, the irregulars and this kind of stuff, and Noel Coward and what you're talking about with the Quarter Circle. And I was trying to remember, but Alexander Korda was actually the first director to be knighted. So
Right.
the Queen knights this guy in 19...
And he made Thief of Baghdad. He made a bunch of films that people have seen. If you check out his filmography, he's a good director, but he's a spy.
So what what their job was to influence American thought and foreign policy to joining the war effort, and that's why you find the connections with Bill Donovan and William Stevenson, meeting FDR, and we've got to get into the war and all this stuff, and so that's how it actually played out. Was these British spies who, these big theater majors, these actors, and basically backdoor machinations to ramp up the war effort and the propaganda, and that's what you start seeing in Hollywood. You start seeing Hollywood putting out these films that are all about the war effort, all about the Nazi spies everywhere. And I'm not saying that there were no Nazi spies. I'm just saying that this bigger meta-political, geopolitical game of the Atlanticist establishment still required the influencing of American opinion to bring them into the war.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's covered in like The Irregulars or anything on British security coordination, which was in Rockefeller Center. So War of the Worlds, when that's going on, that's 1938. That's when British security was set up in Rockefeller Center. So there's this whole Anglo-American alliance that went on. And then Hollywood was already pre-existing, but before World War II, a strong industry was German films. I noticed that, a lot of what you're talking about in your book comes out of, Fritz Lang and the German and, Lubitsch and these other people who were making, right. But he couldn't be covered in your book because it's called Esoteric Hollywood. So maybe that's another project that you have in the future because they were way advanced. Some of the techniques that, Fritz Lang uses in Metropolis, or even some of the silent movies, I find a lot of enjoyment just being able to sit there and appreciate like what it took to make these things back in the day. But that's like the whole forerunner, like a prequel to your book.
Well, it spills over because, like Hitchcock's really influenced by the German expressionism.
Sure.
So, I mean, and I think
Billy Wilder too. These are all guys who.
Yeah, the film noir is influenced by German expressionism and surrealism, absolutely. And I could have done that if I wanted to. I mean, I don't think anybody would have.
No, I'm saying that could be a future project.
Yeah, right. But yeah, it's just there's so many different angles that you can go with this, and I came across fairly solid information about a lot of people that you wouldn't expect spying for like the FBI, like Jimmy Stewart, and it kind of makes sense because if you study the period where you had the Hollywood 10 and the idea of the HUAC investigation and there's all these commies in Hollywood, and at the same time I was reading Tragedy and Hope, and you see Quigley talking about the fact how this was all ramped up.
Yeah,
like there weren't that many communists in America, that it was actually the FBI working with Hollywood that hyped up this so-called threat, and they would actually allow the films like Spartacus, right, which is Kubrick, which is about the slave revolt, and that ties into Illuminism, so-called, because Weishaupt and his cadre, they would use these names like Spartacus, Weishaupt, and so forth as their code names, right? And so Kubrick, I think, intentionally chose that because it's about the uprising of the slaves and so forth. I'm not saying that Kubrick was a bad guy necessarily, but I'm just saying that a lot of the people in that period were not as hip to the meta political game like we are today. So they probably didn't understand that the big foundations are, funding a lot of this leftism and this Marxism and socialism. So anyway, all of that comes out, and, you begin to see how, it does make sense that Jimmy Stewart would be part of this movie called The FBI Story that has J. Edgar Hoover giving an introduction to the film. And then it's really goofy because it's Jimmy Stewart, like throughout history, being this American hero. And that's supposed to be embodied in the FBI. So it's like there's a section of the movie where he's in the Old West and he's this law guy, sheriff. And somehow this translates into him being an FBI. It's just really goofy, but you start to see, man, all of these movies are like, in some way, if not esoteric, they're propaganda, and you can tell that Hoover and the FBI are putting this message in there.
Well, I think what you're describing is different points through Hollywood's history. stars get a certain celebrity power with the audience, and so it's useful to divide and conquer them. So I think if memory serves, it was Jimmy Stewart who was ratting out Australian actor Errol Flynn for being a Nazi supporter at one point, and then it talked to
Cary Grant.
Oh, so it was Cary Grant? I thought it was Jimmy Stewart, because Cary Grant, you said, was hanging out with Humphrey Osmond and was working for British intelligence. And I was like, well, Osmond was the LSD experimenter. So I thought it was Cary Grant and Humphrey Osmond, and then Jimmy Stewart and Errol Flynn.
No, Stewart was looking out for commies.
Okay.
So he was trying to supposedly aid the FBI and rooting out the commies in Hollywood. But it was Cary Grant who was whispering or saying, supposedly the accusation is that Errol Flynn was actually a Nazi spy, which makes more sense because he's a little bit earlier, and he would have been like, he's portrayed as an OSS guy in Notorious by Hitchcock,
right?
And so he would have been looking out not so much for commies but for Nazis. That's at least what the accusation is. I don't know if that's true, and if you can look at biographies of Jimmy Stewart that talk about him, working with the FBI, but I think it's very likely because there's just so many cases of these people who, like you said, they attain a certain level of status. And the reason that actors or A-listers could be useful in that role is that they're going to be exposed to so many levels and strata of society that most people are not. You're going to be invited across channel. You're going to be invited to other countries. You're going to be meeting with dignitaries. You're going to be meeting with other famous people. You're going to be meeting with heads of state. And not many people can do that. I mean, even if you're a head of state, you're still kind of limited in who you're going to meet with. But because of the power of Hollywood, right? I mean, there's just so much more that you could do potentially. And that's why you'll find so many of these patterns of, like Natalie Portman's grandmother working for British intelligence as an asset. You know what I mean? There's just so many of these kind of connections that it's just. Well,
she's an Israeli citizen, right? So if she was a spy, she probably wouldn't be a British spy, or maybe she would be. I don't know.
Well, you never know for sure, because a lot of times foreign governments will recruit people from another nation. So could she be a Mossad? Well, that could be, but I mean, is
there a difference between MI6 and Mossad? Talk amongst yourselves.
Well, MI6 is who set up the CIA and the Mossad.
And so MI6 comes from the East India Company's intelligence system under the various kings and queens prior to that. And so it's like it's a front end information gathering and covert network for the elite. That's like the other side of the intelligence agencies, the top side, the people that get to use it for their will. That's kind of, so that you talked about Howard Hughes having that access. After you get to be a super billionaire and you contribute into their establishment, then you get access to their resources.
Absolutely. Exactly. And it's just kind of like clubs and mobs. I mean, this is all probably basic stuff. We're all aware of this, but it's just that the Hollywood angle was one that not many people have gone down. There are a few academic books that people have published on the topic. Operation Hollywood, CIA in Hollywood. Philip Rizzo wrote a book on like drug connections and intelligence connections to Hollywood. But I just think there's so much more that you could plumb there. So many different angles you go down. Like, for example, if you remember Abramoff, who was involved in the Valerie Plame scandal and the yellow cake and all that. And there was like some kind of money laundering thing that he was involved in. Well, before he was convicted, he made this B movie with Dolph Lundgren. And it's like he made this bad Cold War Dolph Lundgren movie called Red something. I don't know. My buddy Mark Hackard actually brought this to mind. I didn't even know this. Mark Hackard brought this up. But so what you figure out is that, well, sometimes these movies and these themselves might actually be fronts or shells or means of doing something else. So it's not to say that they don't make the movie, but one thing you start to notice if you research this stuff is, why do these movie companies just like go bankrupt all of a sudden? Like, you can have this TriStar Pictures or something like this that's hugely successful for a decade, and then all of a sudden it's just like, boom, oh, they're gone, they're out of business. Well, it could be many factors, it could be mismanagement. I'm not saying that, but I've actually found articles that discuss these kinds of companies being shells and fronts that are liquidated or fire sale type setups, just like you see in things like Enron.
Right.
or what we saw with companies, big billionaire capitalists trying to loot Greece.
Well, I think it's more than that. I think it's systematic, and I think it's expected. People don't expect Hollywood companies, the production companies, to make money, because it's just like the book industry. Most books don't make money. They don't sell most books that are out there. So I think there's two different sources. There was Ed Epstein, who had written a book. He like embedded himself with Oliver Stone, and I think it's called The Big Picture, where he tells you how Hollywood works and how they build up these huge budgets and exacerbate all this stuff. And then basically it's like Goodfellas, where they take all the credit from the joint and then they burn it down at the end. And they're out of there. Yeah.
I was reading there's sort of one of these fringe books, Joe Bob Briggs, who does the Dallas, whatever, I forget his newspaper, but he does the movie reviews for one of the big Dallas papers, and he likes a lot of this fringe grindhouse, sort of weird stuff. But there was a fascinating analysis that he did in his book of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and what he says was that they didn't think this movie would make that much money, and that it was actual mob guys. And he doesn't say which mob. I don't know if it's Italian or Jewish or what, but he just says mob dudes put money into the movie, just a very little amount.
Yeah.
Because it didn't cost hardly anything to make this movie. And then it just like exploded. And so the actors had signed on to getting some percentage, of the potential profits, which they didn't expect to be very much, because it was just this gross B movie, Well, the movie ends up making like $50 million, some crazy amount for the 80s, right? Or late 70s, whatever it was. And so the mob dudes just took the money. Nobody got paid anything. And the irony was that this is off topic, but this actually ruined a bunch of people's careers. Like, a lot of these people thought they would go into acting, but the movie was so edgy and gross and vulgar and disgusting that people could no longer get hired in films from being in Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
So it made them radioactive. Yeah.
Yeah. So they had to like go into, doing other stuff. And I guess Tobe Hooper moved on to do a few more films, but it's just very bizarre that you had this admission of, all of the money, all the millions of dollars was just totally taken. Nobody got anything from that. And so what I'm getting at is that's probably pretty commonplace.
So I wanted to, I've been monopolizing the time. I wanted to open up to Brett, Kevin, and Dylan to see if they had any questions about your work over the years at Jay's Analysis, or specific items we've touched on. Basically, my favorite parts were where you talked about Kubrick and you analyzed his work. Then you talked about H.G. Wells and Freemasonry and kind of tied that into transhumanism. And then you broke down Spielberg's work. Then you did some children's movies like Never Ending Story. So it's like I'd seen all about. I'm not a big fan of David Lynch. I know you got a David Lynch t-shirt on. So those were the movies where I was like, I don't know exactly what he's saying, but given what I've seen on these other articles, like it's an intense analysis, but it's not beyond anyone that I know's comprehension, because we all enjoy the movies,
Good.
So
yeah, that was, yeah.
So Brett or Kevin, I didn't know if you guys had anything to ask Jay at this point, or if you're content listening.
I've been happy to listen. I mean,
I put him asleep. I talk and it's like.
No, in the last 15 minutes, I've gone from, the party in Eyes Wide Shut to the Cooler in The Shining to Ian Fleming. So there's a lot of different directions we could go. I did want to talk a little bit about or just get Jay's thoughts on the irregulars, like the Fleming and the doll, and how that seeps into American culture. We touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to hear him discuss it more. The sort of Fleming connection to intelligence, I always find very interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating, because I'm not sure how deep you're into that, but
we're into it, picture, man. Tell us everything.
Well, the rough picture is just that he was recruited probably in a boarding school when he was young, and I think he was in Germany, and he was kind of a upper class from money. I think there might have been some nobility in his genealogy. I'm going from memory from the Leipzig bar.
You're talking about Ian Fleming, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Fleming comes from Robert F. Fleming and Company. His grandfather was a billionaire, and so he and his brother are heirs to the family fortune. And Peter Fleming becomes a writer for MI6.
But I think his mom was nobility, wasn't she?
It's possible. That's true. There is some interesting intermarriage on his mom's side. I put it all in the history blueprint back when I learned it. But what you got, the Andrew Lycett book?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of relevant books here. Ben McIntyre's good. So
yeah, I got Ben McIntyre. So what do you got?
So he's got both of these are relevant to what we're talking about. Mincemeat and his big sort of coffee table book. I know you're familiar, but most revelatory is the one I know you're familiar with, the Craig Cobble one.
Yeah.
And so the Lycett biography doesn't discuss a lot of his more secret stuff, and that could be because it wasn't known or debated for a long time. But the other books reveal more. I guess it's kosher now to talk about some of the things that maybe you couldn't talk about when Lycett wrote his biography. But what Andrew Lycett, whatever it is, what he does say is that he was recruited as a young guy and then went into this stuff. And I would say he was Fleming's more or less an average British imperial minded guy. I don't think he was a bad guy per se. I think he was a man of his times, and he believed what he was raised in and conditioned to believe. So I remember looking up what I did some research on his personal library.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had many volumes that dealt with eugenics, race theory, the Galtons. So he was aware of all of that ideology. It wasn't something hidden from him. But I think he thought that was just sort of the natural process. I don't think he was a very religious guy. I don't think he had he just sort of saw it as pragmatic. And that's really the whole ethos of the West, I would say, is that as you get the rise of British imperialism, you just have this caving to pragmatism.
Right.
And that's Bentham, that's what these guys taught in their philosophy. So I see Fleming as the product of that, and as a somewhat, though, critical member of the British establishment. So, for example, the character Bond, as we know, is a mix of a lot of different people and himself. So in the novels, Bond is a middle-class orphan who's recruited into the establishment from the Navy, which that's, he was Commander Bond, right? Well, that's what Fleming did. Fleming was in the Navy, and he did naval psyops. Right. So he was involved in Operation GoldenEye, Operation Mincemeat, all this different stuff. That was psyops against the Germans and spying on Franco and Operation GoldenEye and this kind of stuff, recovering the Enigma machine and so forth. So this is a figure who is part of the establishment. I'm not saying he's all a bad guy, but he just accepted it for what it was. And he's also part of the, as we said, this quarter circle who felt like the ideology of America and Americanism was just not part of the natural order. And then it had to be brought back under the umbrella, of the London banking establishment.
The responsible people to rule over others. They're like, we know how to do it.
So I don't know. I always get these questions like with Fleming too. A lot of people have asked, what was he a good guy or a bad guy? And it's just like, how do you really boil down a person who's a man of their time to some, simplistic good, bad thing? It's not really, you know what I mean? It's not like that. You can't just say he's a good guy or a bad guy. I mean, what is Kubrick a good guy or a bad guy? Well, right. life is more complex than that. And we have to remember too, that people in the 40s, 50s and 60s, they didn't have access to all the stuff that we have. Like we can go online and we can learn about the Anglo-American establishment and know about, stage dialectics, when in that day, you probably didn't understand stage dialectics unless you were like an MI5 or MI6 handler. You know what I mean? Like you had to be at that level before you started maybe catching on to some of the stuff, because those are the people who are taking Otto Skorzeny or Reinhard Galen and using them to train Mossad people.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're at that level when you start noticing that, oh, this is a game. This is we're playing these.
I think groups. Fleming was writing from that position though, given his family heritage and where he was coming from, because no one ever talks about him being from, like, so I only found this because before I interviewed John Loftus, he said some quip about the Rothschilds. He's like, they're not even listed in Fortune or Forbes 500 or whatever. And so they're actually listed as a family dynasty. They're listed. And when I looked at the other family dynasties, there was the Flemings. And sure enough, is that the same Fleming family as Peter and Ian Fleming? Oh, yes, it is. And it was Robert F. Fleming and Company that made their money back in the day from opium trading. And like you were just saying about, Adam Smith and Bentham and these guys, they were pragmatists. Yes, it's okay for them to sell opium to China and subjugate that nation because they have the right to rule. That was their opinion, right?
And we know now, I believe, and this is why I talk a lot about Darwinism and social Darwinism, is that it fits well with, the Malthusian Galton thesis, and it attempts to give a kind of justification for what you're doing. I mean, we are destined to stamp out these people. It's just our destiny. We're destined to rule those people. And so there's no, in geopolitics, the argument goes, there's no good guy, bad guy. It's, pure power politics.
Right. The absence of logic and reason.
And by the way, Valentine, I couldn't find any information that Ian Fleming himself was a Mason, but Valentine Fleming was a Freemason. So that could suggest just another connection to the establishment that you're pointing out.
Yeah, I've never seen anything that Ian Fleming was involved with Masonry, but he definitely rolled around some people who were into that. And, from anywhere from Cecil Rhodes into, all these other guys who were participating in Hollywood. A lot of them were Masons. I think John Ford was a Mason when he was working with OSS and these types of guys. J. Edgar Hoover was a Mason. And I'm not saying they all share some big club, but there's rites of passage and access to certain personalities that otherwise the layman doesn't have.
Well, what I was trying to get at, I guess, with Fleming was, so if you look at the novels that he wrote, they're absolutely revealing a lot of tricks that the establishment uses, like, putting onto the enemy the very thing that you're doing, right? So, look, all the Soviets and the Chinese, they're so dastardly, they're so devious, they're all Blofeld, they're all Dr. No, they're all up to this skullduggery, and they're going to nuke us, and they're going to send V2 rockets. But this is actually all the stuff that your empire's doing, right? So this is basic kind of psyops, where you use the pop culture, and that's why Bond and Fleming is so important. Is that it's probably the most powerful, iconic image of pop culture propaganda. And I'm not saying that means that everything about Western society or Western white dudes is bad. Like, if you read the secondary literature, you'll get a lot of feminists who will say, they'll agree with that point. They'll say, yes, you see, Bond was Western British imperial propaganda. And then they'll turn around and say, and he's bad because he's a white dude. You know what I mean? Right. So you'll get that kind of feminist reading of Bond. But I'm saying it's more than that. It's Bond as kind of the iconic embodiment of pragmatic imperialism. And that comes out in the novels, because Bond will say in Casino Royale, who cares, to Vesper Lind, he's like, who cares about ideology, good, bad, east, west? It doesn't matter. If I can, hack out a good living doing this, and if I can, drive an Aston Martin and drink wine and
have a license to kill. Yeah.
If I can bang some babes and have a license to kill, that's better than, whatever I was doing before as a Navy grunt or whatever. So it's pure pragmatism. Although you could argue that over the span of the novels, because Bond eventually gets married and he doesn't like M very much, and he's kind of like, he realizes he's a tool. You might argue there's some character progression on the part of Bond. But I think that for Fleming in his day and his time, he just saw it as the natural order, quote unquote, of things. And that's just how it is. Just what you do.
And Fleming also, he downwrites Bond because Fleming considers Bond to be a blunt instrument of power, whereas Fleming feels like he's on the handling side of blunt instruments,
Yeah, that's why I was asking for some expansion on that, because there's kind of a mainstream mundane story that, yes, Fleming works in counterespionage during World War II, but he's not a high level guy. He might be an important guy, he might be a useful guy, but he doesn't have the kind of the access. And he starts
That's not true. Yeah. He arranged the Rudolf Hess, getting Hess to turn himself over.
Oh my God! And
right, mincemeat.
the Aleister Crowley stuff, yeah, I mean, I would say that's access. But that he starts to basically, and again, mainstream sort of origin story of the James Bond character, he starts to fantasize about, wouldn't it be neat if this happened? Wouldn't it be neat if that happened? And that never really convinced me. So I'm just interested. That's why I asked the question. I'm kind of, and then when
he's trotting the globe, hanging out with Aristotle Onassis and heads of state and actors. I mean, the dude obviously is up to like high level shit. I mean, you have to be stupid and naive not to figure that out. So that's just kind of like, that's just kind of propaganda that you're talking about, where you get these mainstream stories of
playing it down.
Oh, he didn't really do anything. He was just this pulp fiction writer.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, it is also mainstream that he was part of this group of irregulars that tried to diminish whatever, a sense of isolation to get the U.S. into World War II, that he was directed by, what was the guy's name? William Stevenson. Him and Dahl were both a part of that. So that's very intriguing. Well, and it doesn't really fit the mundane story.
Well, and the ambassadors also were like acolytes to Cecil Rhodes, Lord Halifax, and Kevin knows the other one. But yeah, all the guys involved were trying to carve out this. How does the British Empire continue to exist in this day of nation states?
It's Fleming and Stevenson and some of the other crew, literally, who went to Donovan and said, "You need to set up an OSS," and they helped convince, the National Security Act to go through. Right. So, I mean, that alone tells you that the story that he wasn't that important is ludicrous.
Right.
I mean, if you're sailing around on yachts with Aristotle Onassis, you're important. I mean, it's just, you are. I mean, that dude is was a magnate. You know what I mean? He wasn't just shipping dry goods.
Yeah, he's a tycoon. He's a tycoon.
He was shipping other goods. So, and you find all these little tidbits that he's the one who said initially that he would fund a movie. It didn't actually happen. It was somebody else, but he told Fleming, "Hey, I like your story. I'll put the money up for Dr. No." So, you'll find all kinds of connections like that, and it's just an endless rabbit hole. But you're absolutely right that there was already this plot on the part of British intelligence and Stevenson and guys working out of Canada to, as you said, in Rockefeller Center, to have this little base of operations there to make sure that the non-interventionist, notions of America First were not successful.
Right.
And that is precisely what Quigley plays a part in. Quigley is playing a part in being an apologist for interventionism and the liberal world order.
I would agree with that. And I think the book ending of FDR's radio address, on December 7th, 1941, they lived in infamy. That whole thing was only made possible because of the 1938 War of the Worlds, and they had figured out what is the real power of radio to convince people of a narrative. And it's not so much news because it's now this bigger story. It's called World War II, and they had branding on it and this whole sort of thing. And tracing the origins of that, you go back to how World War I actually got started. So there's this whole continuity, and your book picks up kind of in the middle of it, like in the 20s, 30s, where Hollywood gets involved in this overarching English-speaking people's kind of plan.
Right. So a lot of people ask about the Jewish influence in Hollywood, and the reason that I didn't really cover that in depth was because I'm a secret Jewish agent, as many people. I'm joking. I could start to do my Woody Allen. I could do my Woody Allen voice. I don't know. But the history of the Jewish moguls early on is interesting because even if you watch documentaries that discuss, Empire of Their Own is a great one.
Yeah.
A lot of the Jewish moguls would actually give up their Judaism. So they would marry Gentile wives. And then by the time that they were having kids, they were putting their kids in Catholic schools and really had no interest or concern for the traditions of Judaism. And they were actually making movies at that time about that. I think The Jazz Singer or one of those old Hollywood classics is about that, where this guy's like a cantor in his synagogue, and then he gets into singing jazz, and then he basically forsakes Judaism. Or
I think it might be The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson.
Yeah, or he ends up not forsaking it, or I forget the plot. But so I take it to be a situation where it's not so much a religious ideology that's impelling people, but rather they're acclimatized to the realities of the situation in which they found themselves. And so they were ousted by, just like Catholics were at that time period. Jews and Catholics were not welcomed into the WASP establishment.
Right.
They couldn't go to the country clubs and so forth. Right. So it took time to rise amongst the ranks and achieve social status and so forth. So that's why I think the British imperial angle is more important, because it was, again, when we think about the nation state of Israel, when we think about Hollywood, these are not entities that just sprang up on their own. They actually come out of the older machinations and planning and strategies of the British Empire. And that's what's so crucial. And so, again, the nation state of Israel could never have existed in the modern time without Balfour Declaration and without British imperial support. So I see it as a bigger game of, yes, there's a lot of Jews that have power in Hollywood, but I don't think those guys are particularly religious or that they have much concern for what's happening,
They absolutely didn't. I forget who wrote Empire of Their Own.
Neil Gabler.
Gabler.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the term originated with him or with Thaddeus Russell, who's on my show frequently, but they called it a cultural holocaust.
Yeah.
Committed by Jews against Jewish culture in America for the very reasons that Jay is describing, because they wanted that access. And if it meant, especially with all the baggage that came from, coming from Eastern Europe or Central Europe in the 1910s or 1920s, even before Hitler, the open anti-Semitism starts in that region with like Fichte, if not before, the state within a state. So by the time, if they had a reset button and they had a fresh start and they had that kind of influential power, they wanted there to be nothing Jewish about them. I think in that book, maybe it's in Renegade History of the United States, Thaddeus Russell's talking about them, going to parties and making anti-Semitic jokes. The best line in the book, read beautifully by whoever does the audiobook, is somebody approaches, whether it was Mayer or one of the others, about a charity for relief for Jews. And he says, relief for Jews? How about relief from Jews? And he was Jewish, So that was a pervasive attitude in Hollywood at that time, with a purpose for sure.
Well, it also seems like, just thinking about what Jay was talking about, the Rothschild family, Jay mentions in Esoteric Hollywood because of their masquerade balls that they had. There were famous pictures from the 1972 one that represent rituals in like the Ninth Gate and Eyes Wide Shut, right? But there's also the Rothschild connection to Hollywood, how they made that movie, The House of Rothschild, in 1934 that was up for an Academy Award, right? Which I think it was George Arliss that was the main character. He's a good actor. I just thought it was almost, when I started watching it, I thought, oh, this must be one of those anti-Semitic Hitler movies. And you find out it's a self-sanctioned biographical picture made by the Rothschilds. I think it was like Victor Rothschild's parents or whoever that were making it at the time. So it was a family-sanctioned movie with Hollywood actors and Academy Award nominations. And then it's a couple years later, the Rothschilds are involved with Israel only because 100 years ago this year, they had the Balfour Declaration, which was a letter from Lord Rothschild to himself through 5 revisions. So he writes the original. They do a couple revisions. They end up sending it back to him. They're like, hey, we're giving the Zionists Israel. So the only continuity that I see through the whole entirety of your book and like what kind of power structure is out there is this international banking family that we've heard so little about. But Quigley does kind of, he says, oh, they exist, but I'm not telling you too much about them. And then it's a lot of work to go out and try to figure out, what are the actual and factual nature of that company with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any expert knowledge on the Rothschilds. I have a couple biographies. I don't know how accurate those biographies are. They're just kind of mainline ones that I picked up at book sales or whatever. And then what you come across in, a lot of the alternative research, independent conspiracy genres. But obviously there's no question as to sort of the mainline stories of Waterloo and Napoleon and the Rothschild family. I've got mainline histories over here that discuss all that, like even David Thompson's History of Europe, which is just a penguin mainline history. And then amazingly, in my French Revolution classes in college, Owen Connolly, R.R. Palmer, they will actually talk about a lot of this. They will talk. These are mainline historians who cover history of the French Revolution and so forth, and they will talk about Rothschild and Illuminist stuff in the background. I'm not saying the Rothschilds themselves were, quote, Illuminist per se. I think they were more so just banking pragmatists who probably don't have any ideology other than power. You know what I mean? So you can find documentation of a lot of these kinds of ideas, but
it's not well organized or easy to find.
Right. It's
not yet.
It's kind of buried. It's buried, right?
I heard somebody has a project on a book getting something like that done. I forget who that is.
Authorized stuff. This one, the Collier and Horowitz biography of the Rockefellers, which is authorized. I mean, it lays it all out.
I don't have that. I'm familiar with David Horowitz and I'm familiar with Peter Collier, and I wasn't aware that is that a recent book?
No, it's from 70s or 80s.
Is this the David Horowitz, the guy who kind of fled the 60s left?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, why do you think he was? This is 1976. He was commissioned to write the authorized biography of the Rockefellers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if you don't have this book, you got to get it because
I don't have that.
It's got everything.
I got Ida Tarbell's books. I got the Ron Chernow. I've got the David Rockefeller memoirs and several other books about them.
This one discusses Abbey and feminism. Abbey Rockefeller funding feminism.
That's
discusses the setting up of the CFR, discusses Trilateral Commission, the CIA, everything.
Well, since I already read your book, I graduate to read that book.
You graduate?
Yeah, I graduate. I move up the scale of knowledge. Let me write that down. Collier, Horowitz, Rockefeller. All right, Kev, are you there?
Have you read this? This is really good. Servando's book.
No.
I highly recommend it. Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, right on. I think it's running off. What are you on your phone? I see a picture here.
I have one more recommendation that I highly, highly recommend. Have you read this?
Afghanistan's Untold Story by Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. No, I haven't.
It's about British imperialism in Afghanistan. Very, very good.
Yeah, I've learned about the first, second, and third Anglo-Afghan wars, but I haven't read that book, so that is on my radar. So out of all the topics you cover in your book, what do you think was the favorite? I mean, obviously you've watched a lot of films, more than once. You've paid close attention. What was your favorite, and what do you think the overarching lesson of your book is for the audience?
The overarching, let's see, favorite. Favorite was probably, I know you're not going to care for this, but I've got my T-shirt on because writing about this.
Stand up so they can see it.
Who killed Laura Palmer? Right. So writing on Twin Peaks was the funnest part because I got to go through the whole series, which is not that long, 2 seasons. Yeah. And I wrote down all my theories, and Mark Frost, who co-wrote it with David Lynch, recently put out a book, which is the history of Twin Peaks. And in his book, he wrote his book after I did all my theories. He basically confirmed everything I wrote. So that was very, very cool that the guy who co-wrote Twin Peaks is basically lays the whole storyline out, and it's everything that was in my analysis. And so that one was just a lot of fun. It was neat to decode it. And writing on Twin Peaks, believe it or not, because of the rebooting of the show, has helped me sell a shitload of books.
Right.
So that was what made it fun.
I also found your part about the Wizard of Oz. I've seen a couple documentaries about L. Frank Baum in the Wizard of Oz, and I remember thinking as I'm reading it, I'm like, "Wow, I didn't know about this." Oh, really? Oz means strength in Hebrew. I didn't know that. Right. So there was a couple parts in there where you really, help to flesh it out beyond. You're adding value beyond what's publicly knowledgeable about it. And I've been told it's a wizard of ounces. The OZ and the gold theory and this sort of stuff. And I think I talked to Bill Still about it in October during our interview, but I haven't edited that, so I don't really know that it's in that footage. But I'm pretty sure it is. But your angle on Oz meaning strength in Hebrew, and then tying it into Zardoz, when you did the review of that later with Sean Connery, how it's the last part of Wizard of Oz and then the book. So I hadn't made those connections on my own. I've seen those films. I've looked into them and watched documentaries and read books about them. But I continued to find value that you added that I hadn't found in any other book. And I think it's really an essential book to anyone who really is interested in studying the overarching power structure of our world, plus the Hollywood factor. If you like Hollywood movies and you've seen a lot of these movies, do you publish the table of contents online with your book so people can see like what movies you talk about in this specific book?
That's a good question. I think it is visible on Amazon or whatever, but Eyes Wide Shut, The Shining, 2001, Time Machine, H.G. Wells, Island of Dr. Moreau, E.T., Close Encounters, AI, Minority Report, Logan's Run, Zardoz, Labyrinth, Neverending Story, Legend, Blade Runner, Prometheus, Diamonds Are Forever, Moonraker, all the new Bonds reboots, Devil Rides Out, North by Northwest, Vertigo, Twin Peaks, Mulholland Drive. That's the whole book.
So I think you should consider adding that to the sales copy on the page where people can get a signed copy of your book. I think it's jaysanalysis.com/jays-book. I'll put it on screen, but it's a pretty simple URL.
Real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Brag here. It's been out for 3.5-4 months. I've got 60 5-star reviews across Goodreads, Amazon, and Amazon UK. A lot of books, it takes them 2-3 years to get 20, 30 5-star reviews. So it's really, really good feedback. Again, 95% positive reviews. So I think everybody who, if you've read any of the Jay's Analysis film reviews, and that's for good or for ill, the bread and butter of what I do, you're going to like the book. It's more like a textbook, really, but it's not a boring textbook.
No, you got a good sense of humor when you're writing it too.
Yeah, I try to be goofy too.
Yeah. Some of those captions, I was like, this is, that's a clever way to look at it.
Some of them are inside jokes too. So I keep waiting to hear if anybody figures out what some of the inside jokes were. But
what are some of the ones you're waiting to figure out?
I think I made a couple Mystery Science Theater jokes.
Yeah.
That nobody would get unless they were fans of Mystery Science Theater.
That's one of the best shows ever created.
Yes.
Just doing commentaries over anything these days is people, have to have seen that series. Otherwise they're an original thinker, but that was just brilliant where they would take just these shady old movies and make fun of them the whole time.
Exactly. So the takeaway, you said, what was the takeaway? The takeaway is that, just as in the ancient world, you had dramaturgy or the actors intending to play or portray the gods, and that this would sort of hoodwink the audience into believing stories, myths, whatever, for good or for ill. When we read some of the Platonic dialogues like Ion, Plato talks about how this could be used. Socrates dialoguing with artists and musicians, and he says this could be used for propaganda. And so this idea is old, it's ancient. And that does not necessarily mean I'm not poo-pooing all of the arts or all aesthetics, obviously. It's just another angle that nobody really goes down. Like they don't go down the route of spies in Hollywood. I mean, it's done from an academic standpoint at times, but it's not really done from a pop standpoint. And my book, like I said, it intends to bridge that gap between overly academic and overly watered down, and just it intends to be educational and fun at the same time.
Yeah, it's an intermediary, a broker between these other areas, because there's a lot of books. There's like Robin Wink's Cloak and Gown, which talks all about the spies and the university system and how they use that. But I think so. Reading your book leads people into a variety of other verifiable, legit areas of research that are adversely affecting our freedom until we learn about them, at least.
And you know, a lot of people may be atheistic or pragmatic or agnostic or whatever. But I tend to believe that there is still a spiritual component to this stuff. People might laugh at that. That's fine. I don't care. But I do think that a lot of people in Hollywood, for example, do take esoteric or occult views seriously. It may not be everybody, may not be everybody at the top. And I'm not saying it's all completely controlled by Luciferians per se. But I do think that you do have people that do take it seriously, especially the satanic sort of pedophilic element. And I think that bleeds through a lot of times in films. And that is a part of the book. And I wanted to deal with that and approach it not just from the historical and the spies over here and the propaganda, but also the spiritual side of things.
Well, and you're pointing out what's there. They put these things there.
Whether they agree or disagree with my approach to the spiritual issues, I think, as you're saying, they're there.
Yeah, they're there, and they're coming through their end of the budget, not ours. they're being aimed at us, so we should know about them, right? Brett, Kevin, Dylan, do you guys have any questions for Jay before we move to part 2, where we can talk freely and freewheel about current events and whatnot?
Yeah, Jay, I was wondering if you could speak to a couple different things. Number one would be just a little bit about the mimetic effect of television and film, and what the actual goal is behind putting some of these esoteric ideologies on screen, whether or not it's a social societal infatuation that is being seeded, or if these are more like of a temporal control. Secondly, when I mean the mimetic effect, I mean with the old stagecraft, it used to be more about putting somebody on the stage that would become a model for the viewer to create archetypes or certain types of beings. And then secondly, if you could talk maybe a little bit about the history of literary criticism within intelligence movements and how that kind of feeds into academia.
Yes. So to the first question, mimesis, this is, again, one of those older Greek terms that deals with copying or symbols. And Greek art was characterized by the notion of a perfect copy, a mimesis. And this makes sense because what is Plato's philosophy but the forms or the ideals, which are just copies, the perfect copies of things in the ideal realm. So it makes sense why traditional theater arising out of that would, as you said, you would perhaps portray one of the gods, right? So if it's Sophocles or one of these Antigone or something like this, you'll see certain patterns and trends that even in those plays will reflect Platonic ideology. So you'll have triads that come out in those plays, the three, quite often. This comes up in, I wrote an academic paper a long time ago about triads in the shield imagery of Odysseus. So you can find that kind of stuff in ancient Greek theater, and that's all for a reason. And it deals with, that goes back to Pythagoreanism and the notions of monad, dyad, and triad, and all reality being sort of explained or encompassed by mystical number theory. But the way that it relates to theater and the arts would be that this older Greek view tended to view, in the Platonic sense, the mind as a mirror. So the imagery that you're putting in front of the mind, what the mind is discovering, according to Plato, for example, is not the form that's out there in the physical in front of you, the hard, tangible. It's rather connecting to this purely etheric, purely ideal realm, the perfection realm, the mathematical ideal realm, according to Plato and Socrates, and that the artwork, therefore, has to embody and portray perfection. This all breaks down in modernity when, after a long train of philosophical schools and ideas come about, you have in the Middle Ages nominalism, which is a specific reaction to Platonism and what's called realism. Realism is this Platonic idea that there are essences objectively out there in the world in things. Nominalism then posits rather that all of what we call essences or ideals, they're just verbal token symbols. They don't signify anything other than something that's a social human construct. And so what happens is that this is reflected in the arts, by the arts becoming eventually degraded. Then I think by the 20th century, maybe earlier than that, you could find some arguments to how or where it could be weaponized. I think you get the realization that this can all be weaponized, and that the degradation of the arts, including things like architecture, and this would include stuff like Bauhaus architecture, again, connected to Frankfurt School guys, the idea of promoting degeneracy and abstraction, not because of like some sort of, to make you sit back and ponder the forms. This is abstraction to make you lose the notion of beauty. So traditional Western aesthetic theory, like in the Middle Ages, if you read Aquinas, you would have these notions of beauty being aesthetics being connected to harmony, form, balance. These are all notions that, for example, Aquinas discusses. Once you destroy all that and attack those principles, then the arts become a complete weapon, and you get vomit on a canvas. You get, piss
Modern
in a
art.
jar. Right. So I would say that the people who understand the darker aspects of this stuff that you're talking about, they will even at times call it aesthetic terrorism. I'm thinking of people like H.R. Giger or Damien Hirst, these guys who glory in just ugliness. And so they see it as putting it out there, this image that's going to be reflected in the mind of man, whether you believe in Platonism or not, that's then going to come out in the way that person lives, because it's just unavoidable that man's artwork and his aesthetics and his architecture and his city planning and all this stuff is going to affect his being. It's just the way it is. That's just how humans are. And so that's why, as we all know, it's so powerful to use the arts as a form of toxic culture, as a form of degradation, for social engineering, and for ultimately it's just another aspect of the depopulation agenda. Because to destroy and degrade human persons, it leads to dysfunction, and they can't reproduce and live and flourish and be healthy.
Jay, who is it who said that, like, this is step one as far as speaking to the toxification of the arts, and step two will be having sex with animals?
Adorno. I believe Adorno.
Maybe it was just a prank then. Like,
well, Adorno comes up not only in your book as related to the Frankfurt School, but when I was looking up that Hadley character last night in the Princeton Radio Research Project, Adorno was connected to that as well. I think I sent you a link on that possibly when I saw it. I was like, oh, this is interesting. That the Frankfurt School had a connection to that.
Yeah, I had a graduate level class on critical theory and Frankfurt School Marxism, and that was tremendous because I learned a whole bunch. And my professor for that class was a guy who had studied under a dude from the Frankfurt School. So I always call it Marxistolic succession, like you have in Catholicism, apostolic succession. Yeah. So I was actually taught by a dude who was taught by a Frankfurt School guy. And so I knew I was getting the straight dope, at least, as to what the Frankfurt School guys taught. And then when you go and you read Habermas and you read like theory, this is an important one that I think backs up a lot of what I argue that might be more, I don't know if you can see that.
Theory and Practice?
Theory and Practice by Habermas. Maybe a little more confrontational with what you guys would think. But I think that if you read Habermas, he sort of bears out the argument or criticisms I might have of libertarianism. But that's a different issue. I have to debate that now. But
no, I think we all have criticisms.
What these Frankfurt School guys put out a lot of times sounds kind of plausible. For example, if you read Dialectic of Enlightenment by Horkheimer and Adorno, they'll talk about culture industry. They'll say that the big capitalists run this pop culture industry, and that it's like a regurgitated advertisement for itself. That's all the movies are, is like a 2-hour ad for the next movie. It's just what so that's kind of true. And you can see, oh, these guys are kind of conspiratorial, but there's a deeper agenda at work where you read elsewhere where they talk about the need to degrade the culture and to destroy the West and to liberate women and all this gobbledygook nonsense that we know is just obviously weaponized toxic culture. So, I mean, how do we know this? simple. The OSS brought the Frankfurt School dudes over here. This is in Foreign Policy magazine, right? I mean, so this is public knowledge now. CIA, OSS directly working with the Frankfurt School under the auspices of fighting the Nazis, right? We got to fight the Nazis.
Well, and that's the Rockefellers that were doing that, and they're the same guys, exactly. Nelson and Allen Dulles. They're funding the Nazis at the same time. So it's really interesting when you get into
the Frankfurt School guys.
Yeah, too. They're funding the Frankfurt School guys, and they were funding Hitler at the same time.
Yep. Well, you could start at the beginning and look forward, or you can stand where we are right now and look backward, at the last 50 years, as far as like validating some of this, and look at, the attacks on Western institutions or American institutions like property, family. I'm not religious, but certainly I'm sympathetic to the attacks that, religious people face today. The emergence of globalism, which is, part of this project and others. But yeah, I think there's evidence of this influence in academia and beyond everywhere. And, we've talked about this for months now, and I'm not that old, so maybe I lack perspective a little bit, but has there ever been a time where there was less social cohesion than there is right now? And that's part of the cultural war, to destroy the culture is to destroy social cohesion and, allow the emergence of something new and exciting and better and more enlightened as far as these people are concerned.
We've always been at war with Eurasia.
All they did was the OSS and the CIA, all they did was just take all these Eastern Bloc Marxist guys and bring them over to U.S. universities.
Yep, absolutely.
Jay, do you know anything about
one of these dudes who was literally a former Russian Communist Party member? I'm not joking. I'm not going to name his name, but he's one of the 2 world authorities on Rasputin. He was brought to my university. 13 years, total red Communist Party member from Russia. And guess what he becomes when he gets here?
Capitalist?
Close. What political party might he become as a Bolshevik Trotskyite?
Liberal?
Democrat? No, neocon.
Neocon.
Oh, yeah. Oh, perfect.
Because the neocons are Trotskyites.
Yeah, there you go.
So this
Except you get to go all over the world.
Neoliberalism, like postmodernism, all these words we just describe these people. The politically correct culture. Kev, what did you have? Did you have something to throw in before we knit it up for part 1?
I think he touched on that mimetic effect and how that relates. I would just throw back to you that. So it would sound like any messaging, any artistic expression, encapsulated in story form or for a script for a movie, these would represent an attempt at creating a Platonic ideal to sell people on the idea of one objective reality. Would you agree with that statement? I mean, if realism distinguishes between the mind and nature, and the idealism is more based on, kind of one consciousness or the one idea that stands above all creation or all being. So like movie scripts and these would be attempts at selling a Platonic ideal. Because looking at it from the perspective of like McLuhan and the idea of trying to get everybody on one page, because if you don't get everybody to speak the same language, then you don't have anybody to bring to the table of an international order, which is kind of the basis of the liberal international order.
Right. So a lot of people who, obviously in their own thought process or praxis or whatever, they're probably not aware of any ideals, or they don't care about Platonic ideals. So it's not like a conscious conspiracy of Platonic idealism, but rather my view is that we always function on the basis of there being abstract universal principles, whether we want them to exist or not. So even if we don't think that there's really a realm of forms, or that there is such a thing as universal justice, or that there's objective ethical standards or whatever, or artistic standards, it's still inherent in our constitution as human beings to act as if there were. And I think that smarter people in social engineering or whatever, they're aware of this, and they probably don't really care about the abstract question of whether there really is such a thing as an objective standard. They're more concerned with the usage of that idea. And so I think it's Gregory Bateson, for example, that says that the way that you control men is by capturing their imagination. And this would speak to what we're talking about, because the imaginal is that realm of the reflection, the reflections of whatever is objective or perceived to be ideal. So again, set aside what is real, and just for them, yes, it's just the question of manipulation and management of perception, which will always involve some ideal, and they can shift and change that at will. To, at one time it might have been a strong male figure or something like this, a patriarchal figure. I'm not saying that was all manipulation, but I'm saying that was a more healthy, natural notion of what's ideal for a guy. And now it's becoming the beta hipster, gender fluid. They're changing this into like a more androgynous notion of what the ideal is.
Well, the ideal is specificity, and what they're doing is making ambiguity more important than specificity and definitions and identification, which rips apart logic at its roots.
This is what the Marxist tactic with language has been, and this is the whole philosophy of altering the language to alter the people and the culture. So the 60 pronouns of the new genders is 100% a cultural Marxist technique and attack to destroy the existing population. Particularly, as we said, what's one of the most fundamental aspects of human being is their sexuality, and that directly relates to reproduction. So if you attack that, destroy that, you're just ensuring that there's not going to be strong males or fertile females in the future. That's how you decrease the population.
Well, and I think attacking logic and reason and education and everything that's come before us is, I'm not saying logic and reason are God, but they're definitely the immune system for the human mind. And when they go in and attack these structures, you can't protect yourself from untruths. And then before you know it, you're the president and you're launching cruise missiles into Syria. But these are things
you mentioned. Kevin mentioned literary theory. I meant to mention that real quick. So Derrida is involved in the deconstruction of language and literary principles and so forth. If you look at Wittgenstein, he writes this whole tractatus about everything being language games, and so he would fit into this category as well. And what he ends this argument with is that his own book is a bunch of language games.
Right.
So it ends in postmodernism. So postmodernism, interesting, you can find connections between Western intelligence agencies, the CIA, directly funding and being involved, not just in the Frankfurt School, but also in postmodernism. They were connected to Foucault. They were connected to funding projects that Derrida worked in. And there are leftist scholars, PhD guys who have actually, I've posted the article, the guy's name escapes me now, but you could Google CIA connections to Foucault and Derrida, and you'll find that they were interested in French postmodernism and using those ideologies. We've mentioned spies in the academic clothing.
Right.
It's the same idea with taking ideologies as weapons, and it's not. It could be anything. You just want to experiment. You kind of play with these things to see what the effects are. And Foucault's a great example of that.
Well, and that is their kind of magic superpower as these intelligence groups, because it goes from Bertrand Russell and Principia Mathematica, and then kind of handed off. Like Wittgenstein's like, oh, you can write a bunch of BS and symbols that don't really translate to objective reality and be considered the greatest of all time. And that's basically where that comes from. Yeah. So I remember when I was learning about that, I was like, oh, well, it's not like they're really figuring stuff out. They're just creating another mind loop to lose people in. So you just, I can't understand all those symbols. So it's fallacy of authority. These guys must be smart, and let them design our society and create, continue their eugenics plan and controlling of the students' minds through education.
Well, I might have to disagree with you on one aspect of the loop, which would be that I do think that like a Gödel argument for
incompleteness.
That is actually a good argument, and it's actually a sound logical argument that what we call transcendental argumentation or transcendental logic.
That you can't prove this place from within this place. So therefore there's this whole set of equations no one can solve within this place. That's pretty cool.
I think that's a valid argument, and you can find that argument going back to Aristotle. Aristotle makes that argument against the sophists. The sophists come to him and they say, how can we prove the law of non-contradiction without assuming the law of non-contradiction? How do we know that these laws are true? And Aristotle says, by the impossibility of the contrary. So he says, if we deny these things, you're actually using these laws in the process of denying them. And that's called the transcendental argument.
Right.
So there's no way to argue for that type of a thing without assuming that type of a thing. So strictly speaking, that's not a fallacy of circularity, because the nature of the thing that we're talking about cannot be avoided or spoken about.
Well, it's like an axiom of existence is what you're talking about, because you don't even have to attach words to it. You have to do certain things as a human being to continue living. And no matter what words or belief system you have, these things have to go on.
It's self-evident.
Yeah, self-evident.
Okay, so another example might be words. Like, how do you explain or define words without using words? Well, you can't. I mean, that's just like impossible. So would we say, therefore, that those are stupid questions, or you can't ask those kinds of questions? I would say no, because they're what's called meta logic. They're meta theory questions. And I think they're very real. They're very important. They actually do play into the real world, the real life. They come into things like mathematics and into even computer theory. Will at times use this kind of strange logic, if you will. So in other words, it's not illogical to ask a question of meta logic. And a lot of people that I encounter or have debates with or arguments with, particular certain ones in the past that we're all aware of, they will assume that if you ask that kind of question, you're playing a word game, you're trying to fuck with me, you're trying to trick me and trap me up. I'm saying, no, you can go to Aristotle and you'll find a transcendental argument. That's not fallacy of authority. I'm just saying it's an example of where somebody has used this kind of argument. And if you understand it, I think that it is a solid type of argumentation. It is within the bounds of logic. It may not be within the bounds of normal symbolic logic or typical informal fallacies, but that doesn't mean that it's not still within the bounds of logic. Anyway, that's a big, long, deep, different question. But the reason I bring it up is that, so let's see a practical application of that. When Wittgenstein says words, argumentation and logic is all word games. It's just playing games. So he makes arguments to try to prove an objective point throughout this book. And at the end of the book, he says it's all word games. That would mean his book is word games. Yeah. So he's basically, it's like a cartoon sitting on a limb.
Well, I think that's what Hume did too. I mean, you know, some of these other thought experiments, and they're cool to read. I'm just saying, you know, don't necessarily adopt your understanding system before you check out what all these other people had to say, you know? I think there is a path that connects logic and reason with that which exists through our five senses. And things that we're talking about that we can't sense, they're non-sensory. I'm not saying they're nonsense. I'm just saying they're non-sensory, and that's part of the subjective part that makes up every human being. And I think a lot of these philosophical systems take either or, and it's also and.
Yes, that's a problem with Western dialectics. So I totally agree with that. I'm just saying that that what this kind of argumentation, the reason I would bring it up is that it raises the question of whether mathematical or logical entities are in some sense material or in some sense purely human social constructs, or whether they actually exist in an ontological or metaphysical sense. And I very strongly believe that they do have some real existence that is not purely a human social construct or grounded or found within material, quote unquote, reality itself. And that's very important for questions like metalogic or religion or metaphysics. Is there such a thing as metaphysics? Is that all gobbledygook, right? These become very important. Universals, are they real, or is that all just gobbledygook of the Middle Ages? So the trend, and this is one of the problems that I have with a lot of the libertarian approaches, is just that sort of, basically it goes back to naive empiricism. So if I'm critical of naive empiricism, I'm not being critical of empirical methodologies, which I totally agree with. So I agree with you, Richard, that yes, logic and objective factual claims do match up to our five senses. But if you go back to people like Hume is useful in that he shows that if you ground all of that in a reductionist sense only to empirical reality, you have all of these very difficult issues that arise in philosophy, and you're going to be naive empiricism is a dead end, is what I'm trying to say. Right. So how do we avoid naive empiricism without, on the other hand, falling into like weird mysticism or some sort of cult or whatever? And that's really what I've tried to work out and been interested in for the course of my philosophical career, is those kinds of questions. And so that's a whole other kind of topic or issue, but that's just a window into kind of why I have problems at times with, you know, like a Kokesh type view or a materialist type view or a strict empiricist type view, is that I think they're dead end philosophies that might raise good questions and might have good criticisms, but do they take us to where we want to go, or are they dead ends? And I think you can logically demonstrate with absolute certainty that strict empiricism, naive empiricism, is a total dead end philosophy.
Brett, Kevin, any comment on that?
Yeah, I think what you're demonstrating there, and that a lot of people don't factor in, is when you're talking about meta logic, is that really that all logic exists within the system or the medium that is able to comprehend it.
By
so
definition,
what
yeah.
it really comes down to is Western civilization and a perspective and the historicism tied to that. Because all throughout history, we find these neglected aspects or cultural imperialistic notions of trying to align one culture as coming through this strait or one coming through the other, where we don't really have, and every day we have a form of a crash of absolutism through a new historical finding or something that predates the earlier origin myths of humankind. So what it really comes down to at its base, not touching the Platonic argument so much that an object itself doesn't exist in reality or isn't viewable to all parties. It really comes down to a notion of insularity and the in and out group that is created by language in those that share language. So, like, the course of history has always been the domination of one language over the other and the attempts to upset the intrinsic value of other cultures that don't hold your beliefs by labeling them to be barbarians. So even Heinz von Forster, who was the famous cyberneticist,
yeah.
he invented second order cybernetics. And he has a ligature to Wittgenstein, because when he was a young child, his mom and dad used to bring him to the Vienna Circle meetings, and he would run around the tables and listen to Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein then goes on to influence I.A. Richards. And what does I.A. Richards do? Him and Ogden create what's called Basic English, which was an attempt by the British Empire, as well as Leo Amory and Lord Percy and others within the inner circle of the cabinet of Winston Churchill.
You're talking like 20s and 30s with these guys, right?
Yeah, we're talking about the same guys that are running the Rhodes Trust after Milner dies. So they create a committee for basic English education, and what they realized was they were trying to set up a kind of a Platonic ideal of language, a basic English, which was supposed to be a 850 word language structure that they were going to use as a mechanism, as an instrument, as a vehicle, much like films are used. They were going to use this language as a vehicle to get into China and to get into foreign consulates and areas where they hadn't previously had an inroad. And by doing this, by bringing in basic English, then you can see the historical properties from this, where they create liberal arts colleges, because the goal has always been to, foster this republic of letters that has the meritocratic overlay that allows people to be filtered into the positions of power. So I think within all of this discussion about nominalism and about the ideal and Platonism, without even devolving into a purely rationalistic perspective, I think it can be said that the light of knowledge is always subordinated to the medium in which it speaks. Now, of course, you can look also at the Christian religion, which is predicated on the notion that the word of God or language is the unifying factor. With both of these philosophies having a parallel or a similarity, in that they're meant to create a fellowship, an insular fellowship or an insular polity, much like they were trying to do with the Pilgrim Society and some of these other international groups. Because the basic truth of, like, quote unquote Freemasonry, the secret of all secret societies, goes back to Pythagoras trying to hide that he couldn't solve the problem of universals or Euclid's problem at the time. So they created secret societies to hide from the people within their area that they didn't have all the answers, that there was still this neglected aspect. And that's what Heinz von Forster says in the Net documentary. He says that at the highest levels of mathematics, it really devolves into art, because at that level, you don't have enough people that are able to understand or comprehend the nuances of the arguments that you're making mathematically. And then this is also picked up by John Crow Ransom, who says to the elite and those that I know, art is the only religion. And then he talks about how, like, the reason why that they come to this philosophical viewpoint is that the light of knowledge is subordinated to the earlier authoritative claims. So over history, over time, you see these constant rebellions, or not using nominalism, saying that this doesn't exist in reality, but using a linguistic nominalism to consciously reject something in order to stand outside of that universal. So I think there's some room there where it's not a nominalistic rejection of saying this doesn't exist or have objective properties. It's a recognition that all knowledge and everything else is encapsulated within language, which is the secret of Freemasonry when you get down to it. The secret of Freemasonry, the secret of the Illuminati, the secret of the secret societies going back for many
Coming
years.
up next in part 2. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
It has been to obscure the truth that a tree is not a tree intrinsically, that there is a mind-nature divide in humanity, unless one takes the argument that human beings are the arbiter of this whole existence, in that we have dominion to murder, kill anybody that falls within something that I don't agree with.
No, they have to make neologisms anytime they find something they hadn't had a name for before. They're like, what should we call this? Oh, my name, your last name. They name stars like that all the time. So there's proof that mankind is always giving, mouth sounds to things.
And Thomas Jefferson found, by studying the Native American cultures, as I've said before, that the way that tribes could separate from each other, you would have one clan, they would all speak one language, but in order to upset the unity that tribe was trying to perpetuate, they would then start a whole new language that would create a barrier between those cultures. So it's not to say that, like, objectively the attributes cannot be objectively defined and what they are. It's to say that a tree is only a tree because a lot of people have agreed that it's a tree, and that over time that has historically been the case. And the only argument against that would be some kind of transcendent force that originally came down and gave names to things, which, like, if you look at the American Revolution,
that would be Spielberg's Aliens, right, Jay?
Because Thomas Jefferson said that, we have the power to begin the world anew. We don't need to look at the Greek and Roman cultures anymore for our analogical reasoning to base our culture upon, because they were using a new unity, which was supposed to be law. And then the rest was supposed to be that order out of chaos. We only.
Yeah, but see, okay. Well, there's a couple things I disagree with here. Number one is the idea that you can study a bunch of guys in the modern world, even going back to Jefferson, without looking at their presupposition. So Jefferson has a very naturalistic presupposition. Now, it could be right, could be wrong. I'm not saying that he's wrong because he has a presupposition against supernaturalism.
It's perspective.
He has, right. So, and I understand the argument that obviously the secret societies are very interested in controlling language. However, I don't think that there is a clear proof or argumentation that what Freemasonry teaches, or that their secrets, so-called, actually do go back to Pythagoras. So, for example, there are numerous writers and theologians and people from the time of Plato and Pythagoras all the way up to Descartes or any of the moderns. There's a whole bunch of people within this span that I've read and spent a lot of time in, who are who I have a lot more respect for than somebody like even a Pythagoras. So there's a whole bunch of, say, Byzantine theologians who were very aware of the debates of Platonism and Eastern notions of logos and nomos and law and all that. And this is very fleshed out in a lot of these people. So, and I'm not saying that makes it right, but I'm just saying that we can get a skewed view if we think that I can go look at the way Nietzsche describes language as a tool of the elites. And this is what he says in some of his writings. He says, once you understand that the great mystery of the control of men is through language, and that, for example, the reason that the word vulgar is associated with something gross or disgusting is because some rich dudes and some elite dudes would call the common people vulgar, right? And so he makes these linguistic arguments. So but what I'm getting at is that what I take Kevin to be saying is basically just the Aristotelian argument. Maybe I'm not trying to misrepresent you, but you seem to be saying that, look, when we talk about a tree, it's a linguistic convention that we have decided upon for pragmatic purposes, and it's just that thing. It's the sum total of the qualities or attributes that we attribute that we see this thing over here having, right? And so who cares about the question of universals? This is really just a kind of trick that people have maybe come up with to try to, dupe people or something. I'm not sure where you're going with it, but I think those are actually very real philosophical questions, because when we say certain things like studying the tree as a tree, or that the phonetic symbols that we come up with are just merely symbols, those are kind of missing the question of you're not getting at the philosophical issue of how are we picking out that thing and that thing and that thing and that thing as trees, yet they're different things. Unity and diversity and identity over time are kind of these perennial philosophical questions that guys have wrestled with and tried to answer. And so I don't think that it's solved by just kind of restating something that's naive empiricism. Oh, well, it's solved because it's a non-question. This is the kind of like Neil deGrasse Tyson does this kind of stuff where he's like, well, philosophy is just a bunch of nonsense, and we have science now. Right. The whole point is like, we're asking you philosophy of science. Like, how does the scientific method actually work, and does it presuppose a certain kind of world? Right. So in the same way, I don't think that, I mean, maybe I misunderstood your argument, but I took you to be saying that there's kind of a secret society twisting of the way that language works to where we can dupe the public, and they think that there's ideals, and really it's just phonetic symbols that are.
No, I'll restate. I'll clarify. You make great points there, but when I was talking about Freemasonry and the regard to Pythagoreanism, it was not to say that that being the historical lineage. While you all will find aspects of Freemasonry in different sects that try to claim that lineage, I much more agree with Thomas Paine's critique on Freemasonry and looking into some of the Druidic symbolism and to different time frames. I think that Freemasonry uses that because it adopts that Platonic ideal of whatever works for the situation we can allow to flow through. And so when I say that the basis of Freemasonry,
wait. But Plato's not a pragmatist. So what do you mean whatever works?
Well, Freemasonry is entirely based on Neoplatonism. Like in Freemasonry, from their own mouth, is based on Neoplatonism and the idea that there is a one single chain of being or a fixed reality that is hierarchical in nature. And I have that from many Freemasons' own mouths. You can watch it on YouTube. That Freemasonry itself is based on Neoplatonism, on the idea of selling one common ideal. And so, what I would say to your question about if something is a tree and if something is not a tree, I would say that this is objectively definable by just looking at different cultures that have existed around the world and the evolution of Western civilization. So clearly, there were the Native Americans that occupied the United States, what we know as the United States. Clearly, they had a word for a tree that to them and their insularity denoted a tree. And so the other cultures come over and they perpetuate a cultural dominance, and they say, no, we call this a tree, and it's not a whatever your native word for that is. So it's always an attempt to upset the intrinsic value of an outsider culture by denying their own lineage, denying them to have some other intrinsic value that stands outside of these Western ideas or the Western religions. They could have had their own insular idea of a tree without having to argue that there aren't properties that we could come to an understanding and stand under that would make us have a conversation, because you have to be able to bridge that gap. But my point just in that would be that we tend to look at it from the perspective in which we come from. And I think that if you look at, kind of the intrinsic value of outsider cultures, or the Matabele that Cecil Rhodes conquered, or the Native Americans that were conquered under this erroneous manifest destiny nonsense, there was a word for tree that existed for them, and to deny them their own value or their own medium has always been the goal of all civilizations. Even Carroll Quigley says in The Evolution of Civilizations, in like the first chapter, that Western civilization is characterized by a communal learning, by a communal understanding. And so it's always this like building on top of. And so that's when I say the goal of Freemasonry, it's based in the idea of selling one true objective reality. And in Freemasonry itself, it's based in Neoplatonism, in the idea of a great chain of being. That's why we have the gradations between the entered apprentice and the fellow craft degree, and then the master mason. You have the ladder symbology, the Jacob's ladder, where you have to hierarchically climb to go through this ethical change that, a lot of these secret societies started in kind of like the Roman world. And then as that perpetuated, and the fact that the Romans weren't able to maintain a kind of religious unity across their culture, that allowed for all of these like sects of Mithraism and all these different things to pop up. And then you have these orders, these orders that then become like a model for Freemasonry, that are meant to teach an ethical growth, or meant to teach a specific language. So my main point with that would be is that, we tend to look at it from a matter of perspective, and when acknowledging that logic exists in systems, then you can say that, the only way you can negate these other histories, these native cultures, is to them tie them through the Bering Strait and say, well, they must have came through this other way because we're the penultimate, culture.
So I wanted to be clear. Freemasonry utilizes Neoplatonism. I agree with you there. So I've read Morals and Dogma, and if you look on page 219 through 225, there's a good statement of the philosophy of Masonry. Now, granted, this is probably not what every single Mason reads or understands. That most Masons are not going to read this, but the reason I'm citing it is that I think he gives a good outline of the praxis and methodology of Masonry, and it's very similar to Kantianism, and it's very much nominalism. So what I'm saying is that I think that for lower grades of Masonry, there's all this gobbledygook, and there's all this word salad, and all this occult symbology that dupes people into thinking that you're going to learn all these mysteries. I tend to think at the highest levels, it's viewed in a pragmatic way, and it's atheistic. And that's my view. So now there may be high-level Masons who are Platonists and Neoplatonists. That's very possible. But when I read through Pike, and he says, for example, the chief dogma of Masonry is that there's no dogma, I see a big contradiction here, because he's just written this book called Morals and Dogma that is the dogma that I'm supposed to be bound to, but I'm supposed to at the same time have the free thought that doesn't bind me to dogma. But that's similar to what Quigley says is, the capitalists and the communists work together, that they have no dogma either, whatever works, that they're pragmatists. The manipulation of dialectics is the Masonic dogma. That's what Jachin and Boaz symbolize. That's why Pike can say liberty, equality, fraternity, and republic is what I stand for. I mean, that is Freemasonry. That's why all of the Masonic revolutions sought to overthrow throne and altar and to set up the democratic Masonic republic. So I reject Masonic stuff in total. Like, I don't want any of it. Right. Just because I see it as not Neoplatonic or this or that as its highest level operating system, but rather just something that can utilize whatever system it sees fit. And Neoplatonism is useful because it can at times be a kind of perennial system. It can be viewed as the skeletal backbone of all religions. If you read Huxley's perennial philosophy, he wants to utilize the skeletal backbone of all the religions and meld them all into one for a global government. Masonry is perfectly in line with that, because they see it as we are the real skeletal backbone of all the religions of the ancient world. Well, and that's what ties into the British Empire too. It's like all these things synchronize, they mesh. Yeah. I'll send you some resources, Jay. I wish my computer was up now, but what it really goes back to is to Pico della Mirandola in one of his most famous works. I can't think of the name right now, but this is where the ideas of the gradations and the improvement of the self is picked up through Freemasonry. I have it from like the Master Mason of Indiana, and I don't support Freemasonry in any way, shape, or form. No, but I'm interested. I am interested in looking into the history of it in order to see how it relates to present reality. Like so at the higher levels, you can read. I understand. You can read Cornelius Agrippa, who has a giant 3-volume series on Renaissance occultism, and he's basically saying the same things that Pico della Mirandola is saying. So I understand the Renaissance. That's the lineage. I understand the Renaissance Kabbalistic stuff. The medieval Kabbalistic stuff is Neoplatonism. All I was trying to say was that I don't think that at the highest levels, Pike and these kinds of people literally actually believe in Neoplatonism, unless they are just promoting. I see them using it as a tool. Is all I'm trying to say. So,
yep.
One of the reasons I'm Eastern Orthodox, and I'm not trying to get into a big religious debate, is that I believe that it solves one of these issues. And one of these issues is this question of how does the temporal and the immediate relate to something that's divine, right? And so we actually reject both Aristotle and Plato. We see them both as different sides of a dialectic, and that the solution is a better grounded theology that is not either. It's like part of this is true and part of this is true, but the reality is something in between. That's at least our view. So I'm not interested in like the Masonic dialectics or the Aristotle-Plato dialectics, other than to understand them and to try to overcome them. But this gets into really deep, heavy territory. We may not want to go that route, but simply to say, I think Orthodox theology does have a good answer to this question. And I would also add that, let me give you an example of something in the modern world where I think this leads us in the direction I'm talking about. So we have mathematical entities that do appear to be real, that cannot be imagined by the human mind, like a Mandelbrot set. So if you look into the Mandelbrot set, what it suggests is that, as Roger Penrose says, that there has to be some realm to where this kind of a thing is, because it certainly existed prior to its discovery, because the discovery of a Mandelbrot set, which required computers eventually to demonstrate their existence, we wouldn't say that it was invented. It wasn't caused by the discovery. That's stupid. But the idea that human social constructs create mathematical entities is ludicrous. For one, because the Mandelbrot set cannot be contained in a human mind. So it's something that's stands above, it's transcendent above the human mind in some way, in some sense. Doesn't mean we know how, but it's just simply not, because it requires the computing power to demonstrate its principles. So it also shows, by the way, that there's different notions of infinity. Mandelbrot sets can show that. So they also show how it's possible to have unity within diversity in an object at the same time, without the object being one or the other. So it avoids dialectics. It's one of these things like the strange loop, Richard, of Gödel and incompleteness, that points us outside of just the flat here and now reductionistic reality. And so there's a lot of good lectures on Mandelbrot sets if anybody's not familiar with that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that it proves Platonism. All I'm saying is that it points us, I think in the direction outside of mere empiricism.
Yeah, I think the answer is it's not either or for either one of those guys, because I think Benoit Mandelbrot still teaches at Yale. Like, he's a guy who's alive, that the discovery only happened because of computers, and basically to dumb down the formula, every step you go, the system creates a step beyond that, and it creates this ongoing paradigm that is very similar to life. And what Jay's observing is that this realm of forms that Plato talks about is kind of like the mathematical world, and Aristotle's talking about the five sensical world, and these are dialectics. So it's you're made up of subjective and objective components. You have objective needs of your body, you have subjective needs of your mind to understand things, and that's kind of what the learning process is all about.
So if anybody's interested, there's a good book that is kind of an intro to this kind of idea. I'm not saying that everything this dude says is right, but there's a book called Mind of God by Paul Davies. And he's not really a theist per se. He's kind of like a big general theist, but he's pointing out a lot of these things in mathematics that are not just theoretical math, that actually apply to, real world stuff like computers and whatever, right, that seem to point beyond just mere empiricism. And so that's a thing that I'm always arguing against, is just sort of the naive empiricism or scientism. I have big issues with these things.
And computers, to an extent, seem to bridge these two worlds, and I think they prove useful as techne, as juxtaposed to human beingness. But then what we run into is technocracy, where these inventions are no longer being focused at our freedom; they're very much being focused on enslaving people. But that goes back to the same: who's telling the narrative in our society? Why do we let them tell the narrative this way? why don't we find another way and be entrepreneurs and like get these other ideas out there? And I think that's what we're all about, is not just saying we see it and we're subject to it. We can do something about it with the technology that's available to us, you know?
I would just add, I was just going to touch on one thing Jay said there, and I would be in agreement with you that I think Freemasonry really just exists as a kind of a consolidation mechanism, and this is what was even admitted by the British Empire.
It's a tool shed.
Speculative Freemasonry. The goal of it was to basically act as a feedback mechanism for the empire as they would go consolidate the lands. They would have this as a catch-all for those in society that wanted to leg up or wanted to be able to network within that, or to be able to speak that language. And when you look at like the higher degrees of Freemasonry, where like the name of God is revealed as this neologism of Jobulon, you kind of see the arbitrary nature of it all. But I think what it was trying to do was it was trying to act as a mirror for what they saw that religion was no longer able to do within society, within their society specifically. So they were using like a speculative philosophy with these same gradations and channels of ethical transformation and things like that, and especially the lure of this esoteric something to hide, you know, that you're going to learn something in order to I mean, it has great effect because it you know, it's like a left behind force of the British Empire. You know, like they did this at the Goldfields Lodges in South Africa. They did this in the United States. There was some rejection within the American Freemasons and the Grand Lodge of England and some of these nuances for another episode. But I very much agree with you that and with Thomas Paine that, you know, that it was really an arbitrary mythology that was being sold because it was kind of a whatever works mechanism. It was itself a techne. And like you know, like I.A. Richards, when he came to the United States to teach at Harvard University, he became a big player in what was called the Harvard Red Book, or for the Committee on Public Education or Communal Education, and their goal was to reintroduce the trivium with a British historical context. So the people would be doing their analogical reasoning to the Shakespeare's and instead of the Ovids and others, and so it was all about changing the input output processing of a society. So and as you said clearly at the beginning of the show, that we are in an age where the literary is much supplanted by the big screen. And the ability to sell these messages and to implant and seed ideas in people's minds is stronger than it's ever been. Right. And also with that, I think there can be some kind of a feedback mechanism that Hollywood itself creates, where they may not know the nuances of the esoteric philosophy that they're perpetuating. Yeah. They're just throwing some stuff together that they think the audience wants because it worked in some other form.
Yes. Yeah, cookie cutter. Yeah. So, Rich, are you wanting to go, or is this? No.
We could talk a lot more. I wanted to see if Dylan had any questions for you. Did you have anything specific? Because he had gotten through most of your book.
Oh, cool.
No, the only thing I had one question, but basically to summarize what you guys are trying to kind of flesh out was that ideologies compete for the definition of facts, essentially, and that's all we are. Is that everyone has their own idea and they have their own definition of what facts are, and that's all we're is exchanging pattern information.
But that doesn't make for good communication because everyone's talking about something different.
No, you can trick someone pretty easily that way, and that's what it's all about.
Sure.
That's why I said it kind of comes down to perspective. I would be most interested in another time learning more about some of the ecclesiastical arguments that Jay has for his reasoning there, because that interests me as well. Because I think there is, there's something missing when looking at, German idealism and the different attempts to solve Kant's critique on human reason, and the founding fathers upset with Hume and embracing a little bit of Locke, and trying to use kind of a linguistic nominalistic strategy, not negating the world of universals, but using a linguistic nominalistic strategy in order to undermine or to say, F you, I won't do what you tell me. I'm not going to stand under your thinking. And the way that they could do that was only possible because the technology did not exist at the time for King George III to have radio control or television control. It was still 3 months out, and you were getting, the propaganda late. So many things could happen within that period of time that would change the reality as King George was trying to maintain it. So King George is trying to maintain a universal, but the particularity was outstripping the ability of the temporal control to do that.
Yeah, the book that you'll want to read is actually 3 or 4 part series. Will be totally worth your time. Obviously, I would not agree with everything that Dr. Farrell teaches or says nowadays. But back when he was very interested in Orthodox theology and did his dissertation at Oxford, he wrote a famous trilogy, God, History, and Dialectic, which you have to order online now, PDF. But this is probably the best thing I've ever read on the question that you're raising, the whole history of the West and Byzantine theology, grappling with Plato and Aristotle and Logos. And so what he does is talk about the last 2,000 years and what has happened and how we got to where we are. And it's phenomenal. So you would love that. I highly recommend it. And it is worth the $90 that it costs to get the PDFs, but you'll want to print them out and put them in binders. But that is everything devoted to the very thing that you just asked.
Okay. Yeah, I'll make a note of that for sure.
And it has to be ordered from, I think it's payhip.com, and you'll see it if you Google it.
Okay. What's the author's name again?
Dr. Joseph Farrell.
Yeah.
Joseph Farrell.
Farrell.
Yeah. This is before he wrote about Giza pyramids. This was back when he wrote on Orthodox theology.
So what's he writing about? Giza power plant pyramid stuff today? Or I don't think I'm familiar with his recent work.
Well, his new book's on Common Core, so you would
right on.
You would find common ground there with his critique of Common Core, which is pretty in depth. I think Tim Kelly just interviewed him on his Common Core book.
Oh, he did. Yeah, I listened to that. It was good.
Yeah,
was really good.
I'm a few episodes behind on Tim Kelly, but I really enjoy his show, and I'm glad that because he just used to do cartoons, right? He used to draw cartoons. He was a cartoonist. He still is. But then he's like, I got more to say than I can just say in these cartoons.
Yeah. Well, you probably know him better than I do. He just had me on a bunch, but yeah, he's definitely a sharp dude. But
yeah.
So we just want to go through the list here of the 30 impersonations, or what? Where are we at now?
I'll tell you what. Let me take a 5-minute break, and then we can come back and do impersonations. Because I think maybe I don't know how long Brett's call is, but he said he had something at 5:30, and I saw him just get up and kind of go off to the side, so he can be back in a couple minutes. So if we take a quick break and refresh our beverages and whatnot, then I want to work through all these impressions. I can even feed you some lines. We can make a little, cut little snippets out, make a little promo for the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, this could be its own little skit video or something. I don't know.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, right on. All right, so
Awesome.
We'll rendezvous back here like I don't know, 10, 12 after 6 o'clock, because it's like 10 to 6.
Whatever.
All right.
Yeah, a couple minutes.
I'm not going far.
All right.
See you soon.
All right.